Headcount Expert, Season 2, episode whatever. It's an early recording for us. We're a day early, so this is going to be a different vibe. I feel like we're going to have a different juju on this one. But we're talking all about dashboards today. We planned this one out a little bit more than last week, so you tuned in last week. We kind of looked at the way that you apply capacity, a recruiting capacity model to a business, and we kind of freestyled around a little bit, where this one's a little bit more focused on creating dashboards that people actually care about. And so my take is that headcount data is very important to the story of recruiting, and then the story of recruiting impacts the financials of the business, and the financials of the business then circuitously impacts recruiting and everything else. So infusing this information into your dashboards in a way that people actually want to read, that's what I'm here to talk about. What about you?
I'm really excited to dig into this one. Having created thousands probably of dashboards, most of which were never looked at beyond my team. I think this is a really good topic and really good to actually dig into what works, and not necessarily how to build the dashboard, but how to think about how that dashboard's actually going to be used. I think is so important. Hopefully the people listening will get a lot from this.
Yes. And I think it's essentially, this was like one of my first recruiting mentors ever. He's had a bunch of phrases that make a lot of sense no matter what, but like when you start applying them, it like really helped me kind of not just build dashboards without Headcount 365, but within the system as well. It's put yourself in the shoes of the person considering the information, not just like theoretically, like what are you trying to do? And I like your military experience here because, in business, we're like the dashboard, the cockpit, but these are real things where like they are engineered and designed to inform somebody of the things that they need to know in order to not die in the worst possible case, but at least be alerted of risk or like know where to take action. And this, business didn't invent the dashboard. I follow the entomology nerd on Instagram. I don't know if anyone else does, but he just kind of breaks down the origins of things. And it's like, let's start with the origin. You come from a different background than I come from. What did dashboard mean in your life?
Yeah, and it was interesting going from my background in the military to actually applying this in business, and with kind of nothing in between. So all through college, all through my military training, I was focused on aviation. So everything was kind of human factors designed for aviators. How can we ensure that when someone flies a plane or a helicopter, that they have all the information they need and nothing they don't, so that they make effective decisions all the time and don't crash the plane. Ultimately, they want to achieve the objective and not crash. The kind of the main goal we're trying to get to with aviators. And if you think about it, that sounds very familiar to what we're trying to accomplish in the business. We actually, when we're creating a dashboard or information, all we're trying to do is give the operator the information they need to make good decisions, and then not crash the business, and achieve the objective. So I really like to think of it from that kind of lens. A few years ago, I was on a different podcast and got talking about the idea I had when I was first building out the recruit analytics team at Wayfair, the recruiters a heads up display. So the recruiter cockpit as this kind of concept of how can you give recruiters one screen and give them everything they need? And that is the kind of North Star for where we want to get to, and away from the kind of multiple tabs that we had even within a single tool, and just give the recruiters kind of one page that gives them everything they need, so that if they're on a call or if they're communicating with their stakeholders, they can just pull information very quickly and kind of react to that. So that was kind of my perspective. I thought as the recruiter is the pilot, and they're the operator, the frontline unit, and everyone else in a leadership position or a supporting role is there to make sure that they can do their job more effectively. But was there my perspective kind of really honed in. But I'm curious, you obviously didn't come from that background. How did you kind of get to know what was needed in a dashboard, and how did you start thinking about it when you were initially starting to build out dashboards?
Yeah, I used to race motorcycles in like the MotoGP form, which if you've seen it, you there's a lot of not looking at the dashboard of information. So but we all pretend that we're fighter jets, by the way. So like we're the most of it. We're not. Anyway, the point is, I have I start very simple so that it's understandable by everybody. I think a large part of my executive success is the simplifications of things. So the way I simplify dashboards or what is on a dashboard, how I think about dashboards is beeps, lights, and visuals. There are things in this. I'm not a fighter jets. I'm not going to fighter pilots. I'm not going to pretend to be, but in the movies, which is obviously real life, when the missile locks on, there's a beep. Do you know what I mean? If there's a critical failure, there's a light. And if I'm just trying to get the lay of the land, I'm seeing things like a comparison over time or my critical information so that I could predict if the light or a beep is going to happen. So I came into this thinking that was stupid. I think it's smart and stupid at the same time. I'm curious to know, like, does that hit at all in the military from an MIT background, or is that elementary as I think it is?
I mean, so what you're talking about is just like it's human factors design. Like, how do you ensure that the operator doesn't get distracted? So if you have beeping lights and everything happening all the time, you become quite numb to it. And it's like if you're in your car, everyone that drives will know that the dashboard gives you a few insights, but as soon as that engine light comes on, it's immediately visible and it's telling you that you need to do something. And that's how I like to think about dashboards. It's like, what is the equivalent of that check engine light, or that beeping that says someone's locked a missile onto you, or just giving you the information only when you need it and hiding it when you don't. It's a concept called the dark cockpit, where the idea is that if you don't need the information right now, it's not visible to you, and then it's visible when you do need it. So you always have the basic things. In a car, you have your speedo, your tachometer, you have your fuel gauge. You maybe have a few other things, but you're not going to have voltage going through the battery unless you actually need to know that information. So I like to trying to not overdo the kind of engineering concept and the human factors design. But because that's the foundation of essentially what we're trying to do, I think it's really important to think through, what does the operator need to see? And what is it that they can actually action based on what they see that's going to make them do their job more effectively? I love the quality of hire metric, and I can debate that for hours and hours. But I don't think a recruiter trying to close a rec needs to see that quality of hire metric on their screen every day, because they don't actually have any day-to-day influence over what changes there. Whereas timing stage for a given rec, or a kind of red, amber, green status symbol for a given rec based on how many candidates are kind of waiting in each stage, is actually a really helpful dashboard, because that gives you a way to prioritize what you're doing in a given day.
Yeah, I think the reason I've simplified it down to beeps, lights, and visuals is maybe they're just stupid analogies. We'll find out. But in racing, especially in motorcycles, you're only looking at the dashboard when you're straight up and down, and when you're turning, you're away from it. It's not visual. So if something's a risk to you, the beep is just something that draws your attention back. It might stop your behavior. And so, like, knowing the things that are like catastrophic are going to be a function of whatever business function that you have, but there should be some sort of like prioritization of metric for day-to-day operations or business operations. And I think another, like, a very important designation that I think happens in racing, but has come to Headcount 365 and should be applied to this quality of hire analogy that you just made, is like, in racing, there's also logs. So there's a computer saying, hey, here's everything that happened. So if you did encounter a problem that didn't beep, flash, or visual on the dashboard, at least this is information you should know. And this would be over the span of the entire race, not just like in that corner in that moment. And so the idea that you can have the things that are, if we do something or if we don't do something, something major is going to happen, right? At Uber, if we didn't hire a city manager by a given date, that city wasn't launching. The rides wouldn't happen. The revenue wouldn't come. The scale wouldn't be there. The investments wouldn't invest. It was like critical that we hired the GM of a new city, etc. I remember, like, Las Vegas, the cops like shut it down with like a SWAT team. And that was, some flashing lights. It's like, so if we run into these things that are, operationally, these are the things that block a company's success. And those are my beeps and flashes. But I think if we're dwindling it down, like, I'd love to cover maybe, 4 different users, right? The recruiter. So what are the things that are important to the recruiter, the recruiting leader, the finance team, and the budget owner, HRBP, or the person responsible for the overall department. So I'm curious, like, we both come from the TA background. Like, what do you think are the beeps and flashes, or probably a better analogy from your end, but what do you think are the things that you need to notify a recruiter of doing?
Yeah, so I think I really like to start at the frontline operator whenever I'm thinking about this, because everything should roll up from there. So whatever the frontline operator is doing, aggregated over a week or a month is probably what the TA leader needs to see. Aggregated over a quarter is probably what the CFO cares about, and then annually is what the shareholders and the board kind of really care about. So it's really, if you can get the unit economics and the unit metrics at the frontline right, everything else should flow from that. If you start from the top and go down, you're probably going to break it at some point. And so I kind of, for the frontline operator, I like to think, going back to the military analogy, what we're always taught in flight training is aviate, navigate, then communicate. And that's the priority. If anything goes wrong in the aircraft, or whatever you're doing day to day, kind of reminds me very much of what you just said about racing. Like, you're not staring at your dashboard while you're going around the track. You're looking at the track, you're seeing what's coming, you're trying to figure out how to actually do the core job. And so the AV part of it is, what do I actually need to do to work the pipeline that I currently have assigned right now? The navigate part is, how do I plan and prioritize to figure out what comes next? And then the communicate part of it is, what do I need to tell other people in order to keep them updated and actually drive the other two parts of the business? And so if you can work them in that order, with 80% of the work actually aviating or working the pipeline as a recruiter, then everything else should flow from that. What we actually see is, it's normally flipped, where recruiters get so inundated with communication requests because stakeholders want updates, TA leaders want updates, they have to update candidates, that they actually don't have time to do the other two things, which are arguably more important. So I like to think, from if you can get the recruiter visibility correct and give them the information they need to drive the pipeline, then roll that up to the communication they need to communicate back to their TA leaders or the stakeholders. I think you're in kind of a really good spot there. So, like, individual metrics, you can look at kind of the estimated time to fill for a given role, which is very hard to predict. But what you can do is actually look at individual funnel metrics and look at the kind of timing process for people at various different stages. And again, I don't know if you want to necessarily look at individual numbers for each of those. Does someone spend 30 days in a stage is probably not a good sign. But is this an executive search where it's actually going to take 3 years to fill that role? In which case, that could be a green light, because we actually don't need to work on that right now. And instead, we've got 3 people at the top of the funnel that should have been screened already, and they've been waiting 48 hours, and that's a critical metric for us. So assigning those kind of color coded lights, I think, for the recruiter, to give them that ability to quickly prioritize and figure out what is the next kind of 15 minutes, 30 minutes look like in my day-to-day job, so that I don't actually have to go back and reprioritize everything every time I get off a call. So that's kind of like frontline recruiter metrics, without getting specific on what's important for each individual. But I know you probably have some thoughts on what specific metrics are important there.
Yeah, I think, the whole concept of making Headcount 365 was to create this recruiting leader dashboard from headcount data. So while the ATS and the funnel data and the hiring manager information, so from your model, like interview hours of the hiring manager or pipeline volume or velocity, these are kind of the things that are going to prevent a recruiter from hitting their end goal metric. So I would say, like, structuring a recruiter dashboard around what you're going to evaluate a performance review on. And so, I've put this up on previous screens. There's like this recruiter capacity triangle where production is one, projects and experience is the other. And so if you're seeing that my individual recruiter performance review is at risk from one of these baseline metrics, that's something that I want to be aware of so that I can get in front of it. And so from a recruiting perspective, that is funnel, it's conversion, it's interview participation. It could be scorecards. It could be a current project plan that you're following. It could be candidate experience scores, Glassdoor reviews. There's different metrics, but they all should correlate somehow back to, am I going to hit my metrics, which for every recruiter includes, some form of volume. So how many hires per month, some form of quality, which is either conversion rate or experience, some version of like business contribution. And so anything that's going to indicate I'm not going to hit those end goals is what's on my kind of personal, that's what I care about. I then also have pain that is created by other people, right? I want to know what other people are mad at before, like, they tell me so that I could be proactive about managing it. And so if I'm behind on a requisition or an offer was rejected or whatever, approval was declined, I want to be able to articulate to a hiring manager like, hey, here's my proactive solution for that. And that is kind of like my other, beeps and flashes on my dashboard is what's important to me, what's important to my customers. And like, that's how I develop the recruiter dashboard, from my angle. And what I see a lot of people doing, and you might experience this as well, is like, that's not what the recruiting leader is held accountable to. Like in some form they are, but there's this whole other element of the leadership within TA that requires a different dashboard. But before I get there, like thoughts on the recruiter side of things and aligning it to a scorecard.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And when I was first building this out as a kind of recruiter enablement function, I just copy and pasted everything that the sales enablement team was doing. They've been doing this for probably decades, right? Where they already have the data, they give it to their sales reps. The sales rep have, battle cards and dashboards while they're actually talking to potential customers. I think we're starting to see that more and more with recruiting, but that was something that was relatively novel in 2019 when I was first starting to do that. And what I was thinking is like, what is the critical information that you need day to day? And it's like pipeline velocity, it's rec health, it's offer accepts rate, it's source mix, it's hiring manager satisfaction score. Not that you can influence that on a day to day basis necessarily, but you can start to see, where are the metrics potentially deviating from where you need to go. Is the source mix correct based on where hires come from compared to where your current applications or your current funnel is looking? If you know for a given role, most of the hires were made from outbound sourcing and you're spending all your time on the inbound funnel, you probably need to shift a little bit more focus to move your outbound funnel a little quicker. Same with pipeline velocity. If you're seeing people in stage for extended periods of time, that's a good indicator that you're behind schedule. And so you can kind of like really figure out where to focus. And so that's where, I think getting those metrics right up front and not focusing overly on the things that are normally reported in the QBR, like time to hire, cost per hire, quality of hire, which is the debatable one. But actually the things you can influence on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, look, I think for each action there, for each user we'll cover, there's what about me and what about my customer, right? And it's
Mhm.
like if you have a dashboard that focuses on each, and like not to oversimplify, but if I'm going to go talk to a candidate, their LinkedIn, their resume is kind of like their dashboard. That's I'm looking at that as like a guideline. And if I had more information about their personal interests or whatever, right, I could use that to have a better conversation. I could improve my conversion rates. If I'm an individual recruiter and I'm looking at my goals, I want to make sure I'm hitting my goals. And then for the customers that I am serving, I want to make sure that I am in front of anything that's going to make them upset. I want to know before they know. I don't want to have a surprise before they, before that next meeting. And so I think this translates up to the talent leader as well, where it's like, okay, what matters to the talent leader, right? It's not his overall production. It's if we are hitting or we're not hitting our goals, the why underneath why we're, because no one, how do I say this nicely? Because I was this person too. But if you are in your exec meeting defending an individual role, you are doing it wrong. That like you have this time to talk about what's going on with TA as a function and get executive buy-in to increase interview hours, to reduce changes to requisitions, to get their intake session interview rubric job description correct, to do their comp work, right? Individual requisitions is more of the focus of the recruiter because they all have we're in the people business. So you're going to have outliers. As a TA leader, you're looking at the aggregate performance and what are the inputs and outputs for your customers. And as a personal TA leader, right, the finance team and the business, right, if I'm an engineering leader or a finance leader, I want those engineers on the start date for the budget because that matches with finance, but I also want them on the start date on the budget because we're going to make the product on time, which then the sales team is going to sell the product, which means et cetera, et cetera. So like as a TA leader, your dashboard looks different. And so it's like, how are we pacing? If we're not hitting target, why? How do I fix it? What is the impact of these changes? And to me, like, that's what a TA leader is responsible for. And that's kind of how we build the dashboards in, you know, headcount is the hiring plan. Greenhouse or Ashby or iSIMS or whatever is the funnel. And so if the recruiters are using the funnel, it's my belief that the TA leaders need to have the funnel information to explain part of the information, but it's also about what's demanded of me, how much capability do we have, what's the situation, and what's the environment by which we are recruiting. And that's how I look at these different things. I have some specific metrics, but like, what's your take on the TA leader versus the recruiter's funnel? How do you separate? How do you differentiate what's on their dashboard?
Yeah, and I think the key question is where are those questions coming from? I think you hit it. It's not what is this individual rep doing, but the question that our TA leaders used to get asked is how is TA going? Is a very kind of broad general question. And I think your point there, and we showed it on a previous podcast, that the burn down chart, the pacing dashboard is probably the primary metric there, because at that point you have this snapshot in time, you have a forward looking projection, you have the backwards projection as well, and you can tell the story behind it. The TA leader will know the story. But I like to think about it in terms of how many clicks do you need to go down in order to diagnose the problem? To what extent can the TA leader diagnose that problem without having to go to individuals within their organization? If you have, as we did, a 400 recruiter organization spread across the world, it's actually very hard to walk around and just ask someone, why has this rec been sitting open for 6 months? Like, what's actually going on there? So to be able to kind of drill down, I think is really important. So if you think about zero click, what is that initial dashboard? It's probably your pacing chart. It's probably the KPIs that you've set, if you've done an OKR process, or just like set the KPIs for TA. For us, it was average time to hire across all recs, filtered by types of function. It was quality of hire, and we actually set a metric for that. We did think about cost per hire, but less of a kind of like primary driver. And then we looked at the candidate NPS as a kind of a key driver of, are we actually improving our performance over time? So for a TA leader, you've got pacing dashboard, you've got time to hire, you've got quality of hire, and you've got candidate NPS. And they're the kind of like four that I would have. But then you kind of drill down and say, well, why did candidate NPS go down month over month? You kind of click through and you can see NPS by recruiting function. So you can say, well, actually it went up in the business, but it went down on technical hiring. You double click into that. Why did it go down in technical hiring? And you can see where you're seeing the kind of variance. And at that point, you can actually go to the individual who's responsible for that area and say, can you give me more of a story as to why that's happening here? And I think team leaders are generally asked to explain what's wrong, what's different from expectation, rather than tell the kind of the whole story. So I think having that dashboard that gives the data front of mind for the individual TA leader to be able to ask those questions, but then to be able to communicate that information back out to their stakeholders, who are probably C-level, who just want a kind of a quick answer to, like, why are we not closing the roles that we've prioritized? And the TA should be able to answer those without too much of a kind of analysis themselves.
Yeah, I like, in the world of like, what am I on the hook for? I add some one a different. I don't want to say a different layer, but like, I have this overarching, like, am I hitting the plan? Am I recruiting to plan or not? Yes or no? Right. And I'm having Jeff Moore from Toast on the Unicorn podcast in I think next week to talk through the QBR. But we on Unicorn, which I'll pop up on the screen, you could always download it, have this idea of like, what is the QBR I used to implement all the time? It's like the first slide. Did we do it or no? And if the answer is yes, that's my time to celebrate. And if my answer is no, then I definitely need to explain that. And the next thing underneath that is like, oh, well, what about of the things we've prioritized? So there's this like that. And we talked about this 2 episodes ago. If everything's a priority, nothing is. And so having some sort of constraint, using Little's Law or not, to figure out how much you should be prioritizing is like, at least let me hit this subset. And then if you don't hit it, why? And I categorize that into 3 areas. It was recruiting's fault. It was the business's fault, so planning didn't go well or resources, whatever, or is the hiring manager's fault? And those are things like changes, not showing up to interviews, interview hours calculator and stuff. So we, through this podcast, have shown people these different tools, right? A capacity demand forecast lets people see if I was even set up for success. So do I have enough people? The burn down chart shows me pacing. The interview hours calculator shows whether or not we have enough interview capacity to do it. We have funnel metrics and scorecard completion rates in Greenhouse to see, like, are people giving us the information we need to make decisions? And so, like, this as a TA leader, if I don't protect myself against the TA's ability to hit a job, it's always going to be my fault. So TA is the leader, is the usher of like the process at the company, but here's yes or no, here's why, and then here's the impact of doing it, here's what I'm going to do about it. And that's kind of the way I structure the dashboard, is to follow that, so that at the end of the year I can say, well, I hit or I missed. And I missed, but this was the gap. The gap had this much impact, so I invested this much to fix. And now we're on pace to do X, Y, Z. And then you combine this with your general workforce plan change rate, so you get more and more accurate about how you plan your business in the future. And that's strictly from the TA side of things, but that's the way I structure that dashboard. Yes, no, why not?
Yeah, I actually, as you were talking through that, I think it's an interesting framework. There's almost like two use cases here. One is what is the dashboard, the information that you need day to day in order to answer the elevator question of how's recruiting going. You get in the elevator, CFO's in there, how's recruiting going? Very quickly, you can reel things off. You don't have to give specific guidelines, but you can answer the question confidently and have credibility there. The second use case is one-on-one with the CHRO, preparing for a QBR, weekly updates, whatever way you actually, you could kind of sitting down and diagnosing the funnel um, with a little bit more detail. I think that's where having that extra data really comes in. So really kind of like that framework of what do I need day to day in case a question comes up, and what do I need to actually drill into in order to answer those kind of more critical questions and be more diagnostic.
You brought up a good point. Like, if a finance, so like, let's say I've hired the people you've asked me to hire, but I'm over budget, right? So the engineering leader who got their hires thinks it's going well. If I paid them more per, for, if I paid the same amount of roles more money, then my comp person might not be happy, or my FP&A person might not be happy, right? So, but that said, like, let's say the start dates were changed, and so this year it works out, but next year it doesn't. So these are all the things that I built into the, if you use the Unicorn Talent Capacity Demand Snapshot, we have the budget variance in it. But this is what I built into Headcount, is like, we hit or we didn't hit, we're on target or we're not on target. And this is where we are with both headcount and dollars, because the answer with the same information can be different. And, if you're a Ground News subscriber, not to plug one of my favorite apps, then it's a game of storytelling. And so the dashboard as a recruiting leader means, let me be able to communicate with finance what they think, right? If they're going to contribute to my review, how do they think I'm doing? If I'm over budget, or if I hire everybody early, they're not happy. And that, regardless of how much you hit the plan or not, is going to be a factor in your own, reviews. Anyway, I think for a TA leaders are the most interesting because it's so cross-functional. I think the next question, though, is, what is the cadence of this information? What do you communicate with people, and at one, right? So, and when? So, like, you have, on the most broad scale, you have ad hoc or like weekly meetings. You have, a quarterly business review and ABR. There's different times to do this. What are you including and when?
Yeah, I think, again, thinking of a framework, you've got reactive and you've got proactive communication, right? The reactive is when you get an email from the CEO asking, why are we over budget for the quarter? The kind of proactive is knowing that question's coming and sending out all the information and the data ahead of time to show that you're ahead of it. And so I think it's going to vary based on the organization, based on the data reporting expectations, I think, of the senior leadership team, and like who really cares, but also like how healthy is everything. If things are running fine, nobody really cares about a weekly update. But if you're in trouble, if you're contemplating a layoff because headcount costs have spiraled, then you're probably going to want to give that kind of weekly update to everyone. And so I think the kind of like cadence matters a lot, but then the depth of analysis is going to be correlated directly to the cadence. And so the way I always like to think about it is like, what is the weekly update that I can give? And so that any conversations that come up that week are going to refer back to this update that I sent out on Monday. And so if someone comes to me with a question on Thursday, I can pull up the email from Monday and say, well, this is how we're thinking about it, and not have to then go away and do some separate analysis. So if you can get ahead of the most common questions with a weekly update, that doesn't take you too long because you've templatized a lot of that, or you have software like 365 that can do that for you, then I think you're going to be in a really good spot. I think you also have your kind of monthly updates. That's a good retrospective for like what did we expect to happen last month? What actually happened? What are we expecting over the next month or three? And what's actually going to drive that? There's kind of more narrative that goes with that, and that's a good way to update senior stakeholders. And then obviously the QBRs, which is going to be a big topic I think next month, of how do you actually bring everything together, have the seat at the table, and really drive decisions with good data, and ensure that you're delivering good value to the business from that perspective. So that's how I would think about it, and the prescription for what would go into each of those is going to be different. But I think if you can get the weekly top of funnel, what are the main questions correct, the kind of monthly deep dives of actually what happened, what's going to happen, and then the quarterly, so what for the business, how are we going to actually impact the way the business is performing over time, I think you can be in a really good spot there.
Yeah, I used to have somebody at I actually won't say the company, but I remember I used to send them an update, and then they would ask me a question about, I'd be like, "Oh, that's a part of your," they're like, "You can't expect me to read my email. That's not how," yeah, like, that's an excuse. And it's like, the best dashboards are only as good as them being looked at. And so they might have been, in my old analogy, like in a turn there, and they're just like, I just want the information. So I think, like, as a, communicator of information, like coming back to the beeps and the flashes on a week to week basis, I try to align with whatever your P0 is, whether that's a rec or something else. So, like, if you don't care about recruiting this week, then it might change how I alert you of information. Like, I think there's a certain finesse, is that the right word, where you have to read what's going on with the team. You still want them to have their information, you still want the record, but like you have to like align it with their priorities. So coming back to the beeps, like if someone can achieve a goal because of something I'm doing, they have to know that week, almost ad hoc, but it's definitely in the weekly. If someone's trending not to do something and they need to make a process change, I'm doing it in a retro, whether that's a monthly or a quarterly. And if someone wants to know, how do I do something better in the future, then I'm going to show them in a large scale look back, whether that's annually or for the half. And that's really where I kind of like take the learnings of time and show the relationship between what's happening on a dashboard and when. So it's like, how many beeps did we get in a given year? How many flashes did we get? And you could then measure performance against the reduction or the impact of these kind of like crazy things. And you're measuring catastrophic events first, and then as you get more and more like in tune, I think scale ups have a lot of catastrophic events due to recruiting, but the more mature the business comes, now you're just measuring, all right, how many times did we have an outage or whatever, and that kind of becomes that next layer. And so, what are you telling your hiring managers? And you have a crazy hiring manager story?
Probably, but I wanted to kind of just pick up on one point you just made about actually getting the dashboards read, because I know one of the ideas we had for this subject is how to actually build dashboards that people will read and use. And there's like a preview. I'm later this year, I'm developing an executive communication course as part of our new academy, of like, actually, how do you ensure that the recommendations that you make actually get actioned upon. And kind of a key part of that is, you're not kind of communicating data to everyone, you're communicating a story to an individual who's going to be the one who's actually going to make everything happen. And generally that's the most senior person on the distribution list. And so when I first started facing those problems where I'd send out detailed analysis and no one would get back to me, I started to shape the story to communicate to the most senior person, who was this was in supply chain, the VP of operations, who would then ask me questions by replying including all of his direct reports, who would then come back to me with follow-up questions. And I actually built a very strong working relationship with many of them, because I wasn't or trying to get them into trouble by sharing the information, but actually trying to collaborate together to solve problems. And so we were kind of tackling the problem together and both looking good in front of the VP, as opposed to kind of butting heads. And so that's a kind of a preview of something to come. A little bit related to what we're talking about today, given that we actually want this dashboard to be used. And so if you can get the most senior stakeholder to be using the dashboard and communicating in that language, then everyone else is going to have to start looking at the dashboard. Otherwise, they might be caught surprised when they get asked a question, which is actually answered in the reporting of the dashboards that we've set up. So, kind of a quick aside, because I think there's no point in building a dashboard if no one actually uses it, and the way to get people to use it is to have the most senior person ask the questions. So,
Yeah, I agree with that. I think some basic dashboard best practices to get it read is what they want. That's usually like we'll give you the
right.
I have what I have in my system or what I've done as a person, but each executive is different and like they want to be heard, so ask them. I think the next best practice is use alerts sparingly. Like you said earlier, if everything beeps, then you just kind of ignore it. You tune it out. And then that one, boy who cried wolf is going to happen. And that's not great. And you lose your credibility as someone who could escalate. I like to use a coloring system to show red, yellow, green, just so that people understand. And there might not be a red every week, or you might not even get the update this week with any color in it. But when it's red, I know it's time to like talk about it. And then the last thing that I think both of us try to achieve with the headcount stuff is if everyone's working off the same set of data, the dashboard is a lot more credible. So if you are referencing something that they are not referencing, you're good luck getting the message across. You're going to be focused on the difference. And so, when I build something that someone wants to care about, I want it to be something they've asked for. I want it to be easy to find or not cluttered with other dashboards. I want them to be able to easily see what requires their attention. And I need them to be able to see credibility in the data because it's what they're work. I feel like I'm a part of their team. I'm an extension of what they're doing. And so that's kind of how I have gotten people to look at my dashboards. And no matter how good of a dashboard you built, people are going to ignore parts of it. That's just the way life goes. So just have an openness when you go into these types of things to like how people operate and whether or not they're in the straightaway and they have the time, or if they're in a turn and have other stuff to do.
Mm-hmm.
Very excited for your course, though. I think without showing off some dashboards in this, in this meeting or in this podcast, then there's probably some left to be desired. So I'm very excited to see, and that's Meander HQ, right? Where do they find the courses?
Yeah, so we have the Talent Academy over at Meander HQ right now. It's learn.meanderhq.com, or you can just click through on the landing page. And there's a lot of big changes coming next month, so I'm pretty excited. I won't preview too much and use up our airtime because we want to be more educational on this podcast. But I'm very excited to get this stuff out. Just first module is that AI in HR, how to actually use AI in the day-to-day job for recruiting, for HR operations, for talent operations. Like how can you actually get the most of the tools that most people have for free right now?
Yeah, I just saw a post today that someone said the hardest part about being a talent leader is getting pitched all the different AI tools that revolutionize everything, which I couldn't empathize with more, both as a talent leader and as someone trying to sell something. So, I think having a place to see just what can I do with my stuff today is super impactful. So a lot of overlap between what you're doing at the Learning Academy and here. And so great preview with the burn down chart from a few episodes ago. Excited to show stuff in the future. But maybe we'll preview some dashboards in a future episode, but we're definitely going to show off a QBR and talk through that, which is kind of the culmination of 1/4 of dashboard performance in, I guess, next week or the following week. We have to plan it out. But until then, stay tuned. I'll still say this is the best episode yet, but until next week, signing off as the Headcount Experts.